give the Chinese a free run in terms of where they want to go politically, militarily, beginning with the region, then extending out to the with Asia, then extending out to Asia Pacific, and then possibly on a global basis. And they will then let Trump go back to Washington, probably being very confident that he will wreak his own kind of special destruction, and they hope it's destruction that works to their advantage.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to The Focus. It's been a little while since we've been on air. Some of you may know that I've had to step away for a period to deal with a long-standing heart issue. I needed to take some medical leave, slow things down a bit, and focus on getting myself back on track. I've since had a defibrillator, I can never say that word, a defibrillator and a pacemaker implanted. And while recovery is going well, I'll be honest with you, the energy levels are still a little bit flaky. But we press on regardless. And frankly, there's probably never been a more important time to restart these conversations because the world certainly hasn't slowed down while I'm away or while I've been away. So for our first episode back, I wanted someone who could help us cut through the noise, the headlines, the political theatre, someone who understands both the domestic and international dimensions of what we're seeing unfold right now. So I'm very pleased to welcome back to The Focus Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute in Ireland. Scott has become one of the clearest and most consistent voices analysing US politics, international affairs, and the growing instability shaping the global system, from the war against Iran to Ukraine to American politics, energy security, and the wider geopolitical uncertainty now affecting us all. Scott, welcome back to The Focus. It's great to have you back with us.
And it's great to have you back, John. So good to see you.
Thank you, Scott. Scott, before we get into Iran, energy, NATO, Trump, God, there's so many things that we have to talk about. Give us your broad diagnosis, if you will. Are we looking at a temporary crisis in American politics, or has the nature of American power fundamentally changed?
John, it's interesting. I'm going to actually take this beyond America. We will focus on the states and talk about it, but I want to do so in a way because I feel like quite often it's the rest of the world that deserves a look in. And what's happening here, I think, is fundamental realignments, and probably the most significant alignment since 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think there's an argument it's the most significant since 1945, the end of World War II. And why do I say that? I start with the notion that the post-1945 international system, as flawed as it was beginning to bend and possibly break. And I think we really got to that point in between the very aggressive expansionist Russia with that invasion of Ukraine and other threats, with China trying to pursue an alternative system, political and economic, and with the Trump folks who don't believe in alliances. I mean, that's just the starting point there. They don't believe in the United Nations. They don't believe in other international organizations. They don't really even believe in bilateral alliances. They're more transactional. What can you give us? So you already had that in motion. And then you have these events that we've run through, which is this, I think, historic moment in Europe with that Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then the response by the EU and individual European countries. Of course, that comes on the heels of Brexit, which itself was quite a realignment with the UK departing there. And now you go to the Middle East with the Israel-Gaza mass killings. Then you get this war in Iran. And of course, this war in Iran is not only an uncontained war across the Middle East, it's Asia and indeed Australia that kind of feel the brunt of this because of what has happened with this waterway, with the Strait of Hormuz, and this exposure as to how fragile this system for energy supplies, at least until we make the move to renewable energies, how fragile that this system is. So how do countries respond to it? And I'll just give you a quick tick list. I think the Europe, one of the largest economic blocs in the world, one of the largest political blocs, is realizing they can no longer treat this as an unbreakable, unshakable alliance with the United States. So they have to make plans that don't depend on Washington. I don't think this means they become self-reliant. I think it's going to take years for them to develop, for example, in terms of military and security capabilities. But I think that they are going to start moving towards that, and they're going to be looking at others, not just the United States. And I look, EU, Australia, economic deal. EU, India already have the economic deal, which is in place. European Union and Canada already have the economic deal. They already had been sort of widening out in terms of where they are with their links. If you take that across to Asia, I mean, India, flip it. India has pursued trade deals with the UK and the EU precisely because of Trump's tariffs. India, I think, is reassessing its position, as well as Australia, because when you have this amount of instability for the US, what does it mean to be in the Quad?
Yeah.
That India, Australia, Japan alignment, the question of where South Korea fits into all of this. And that, of course, in Asia is with China being right there. And that question of China trying to say, look, we're the one you should be dealing with here. We're the one that you should accept a new type of political relationship. Don't think about it in terms of the traditional way of the US-led organizations. We can set our own terms here. And then if you bring it back, and we can talk about Latin America as well, Africa, but bring it back to the Middle East. What you've had with this specific war in Iran has been that decades of a U.S. security relationship with the Gulf states has been shaken. And I'm not sure if it breaks, but it's been shaken because Gulf states will feel like they have been betrayed by the Americans in that they have now been attacked by Iran, that the Strait of Hormuz is now under Iranian control, that the Americans, despite Saudi Arabia and the UAE urging them to do so, did not put in ground troops to get rid of the Iranian regime. So can we really trust these jokers, right? I'm not sure they would say jokers, but I think you would see the Saudis saying, maybe we deal with the Chinese, maybe we deal with the Russians, maybe we deal with the Europeans. I think we have even seen a split in the Gulf, which is significant in that Saudi Arabia has sort of edging closer back to other states like Qatar, for example, and Oman. The UAE has pulled out of OPEC, which nobody would have predicted a few weeks ago. And that's not just an economic move. That's a political move where I think the UAE is probably the one Gulf state saying we're gonna put our chips on Trump and on the Israelis. Not sure that's a good bet, but it's one they may have had to make, John. And I dealt with this in another video cast recently. I went deep on this. The UAE and the US are discussing a credit swap for Washington to back up the Emirati economy because it's taken so much damage out of this war. So it's ironic. Some Gulf states take the damage and decide we have to move away from the states. Others, like UAE, may have to move back in. So just to summarize all of this up, John, the problem here is that you don't just move from one international system to another. It's not like that. That's not the way it works. I'd always thought in terms of years when I looked at the Middle East, I always thought about a kaleidoscope. And that is you turn one piece shifts, whether it's Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, everything else shifts in terms of what happens in the region. That's now happening on a global scale. And I'll kick it back to you. It'll be interesting to see where Australia goes here. Australia, since the end of 1945, has been very much this idea of whether you talk about the intelligence relationship, the military relationship, to an extent, the economic relationship. It's like Australia and New Zealand linked with the US and with Canada. I don't think that's necessarily the starting point anymore. And I know as we talk right now, and you'll have to talk me through it, I haven't gone into the details. Australia's just said, okay, we're going to invest billions of dollars. I think I saw 7.2 billion. Don't know if it was Australian or US. So my apologies there, folks, but into a strategic oil reserve.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, that's a huge move. What the Australians are saying is we can't count on the Americans in terms of energy provision. We've got to be self-reliant, whatever that means, and in terms of wherever we get our oil from.
Look, I think that the Australian government is moving in the right direction, but again, it's tinkering around the edges.
Yeah.
Living here in Australia, I'm very cognizant of the fact that we're an island continent, far away from North American and European and even Asian supply chains. The fact that we let ourselves be caught with our pants down on this issue says a lot about us. I was going to say, just to follow up on what your thoughts are on this, and that is, we can blame Trump for a lot. He's the great disruptor. Oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and that's great. It's the easy target. My theory, though, is that it goes far deeper, and that is, where were the strategists in Wall Street, or the strategists deep within the capital cities of the West, where they must have thought when they had a bad night's sleep, you know what? Maybe the good times aren't going to keep rolling. Maybe we ought to start hedging our bets and preparing for the eventualities, like the Americans not stumping up, or maybe electing a crazy president, or something. I mean, isn't that what we pay these people to do? To think of the nightmare scenario? Red team this out a little bit, people. If we
Yeah.
would have done that about 10 years ago, yeah, we still would have been shocked by all the things that we are currently going through right now,
Yeah.
without a doubt. But we would have been better prepared to absorb a lot of what we're seeing. And at the moment, we're all scrambling around as though, oh my God, I never saw the fragile international system collapse. Well,
Yeah.
what were these highly paid specialists doing in the Beltway? What were they doing in Canberra? What were they doing in
Yeah.
Brussels? I have to ask that question.
No, I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that deserves a lot of time and thought. And indeed, I'd be interested to see if you put that to former officials. Let me kind of take a different angle of this. Let me walk it back 25 years ago. Uh, you know, with the Bush administration's gamble in terms of toppling Saddam Hussein, that was never just about toppling Saddam Hussein. That was about, a type of US-led order which
Yeah.
went beyond the international system, preponderance of power that they called it, because,
Mm.
they simply try to cast the UN aside and said, we're not, off you go, folks. We're not going to play by the rules here.
Yeah.
And they had officials like John Bolton joking about blowing the top floors off the building. And in a way, they kind of did. And that was almost a moment where I think you would have seen that realignment that could have taken place there. Remember, the
Mm.
Europeans had broken with the Americans over the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
Um, Australia was kind of, even though you're far away, you were still getting caught in sort of the backwash
Mm.
of those tensions. But then, of course, the Americans got their knuckles rapped. In fact, far worse than that. And that is that American play for to be a superpower was defeated. In effect,
Mm.
they got bogged down in Iraq. More importantly, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis are killed.
Yeah.
They get bogged down in Afghanistan. More importantly, many Afghans suffer. But then there was kind of like, both on the domestic front in the US and I think internationally, quite literally this idea of, it was actually spelled out as hope and change. The idea was is that, the Obama years were going to come back and restore the sense of an appropriate, decent, cooperative politics that took place. And that soon ran into various trouble. I can walk you through Iraq, Afghanistan, other areas in the Middle East and beyond. But you still had the idea that the folks in Washington truly believed in talking to you rather than dictating to you.
Yeah.
And we get Trump in 2017, and I think everybody's thinking, oh, God, hopefully he's just an aberration, right?
Mm.
Hopefully he's just an aberration. The guy's a bit off his head anyway, and he was even back then. He was his instability is not just recent.
Mm.
And everybody's saying, okay, we survived Trump, we can get back to this. But then, remember, 2020, COVID hits, right?
Yeah.
And COVID cut a couple of ways. Sorry to riff here, John, but I always find it interesting to think through these things. COVID actually showed, in a very real sense, that the world could pull together in a way and not have to be dependent on the United States,
Mm.
because the US went walkabout on COVID.
Yeah.
You had that whack job talking about bleach and ultraviolet rays and hydroxychloroquine will solve everything. And then running effectively like, the containment effort was actually more like run like a family business, with Jared Kushner running around with his mate saying, all right, maybe, maybe we'll figure out how to actually try to just, get some people protected against this. Australia, I find it interesting where you talk about where Australia has kind of been relaxed in many cases. It was not relaxed during COVID. Australia did not wait, and I know that that runs to a lot of domestic debates. But what was interesting is Australia did not wait on the Americans there. They didn't wait and see what the hell that. Australia went, and New Zealand also as well. Well, we come out of COVID, and I was like, well, and then Joe Biden comes into the States, and you think, okay, and here we go. And then Trump 2.0 comes in, and this time Trump 2.0 is much more organized in the destruction.
Yeah.
It's much more organized. And that's, I'm not excusing anybody from what you talked about. It's just I can see the side where everybody still thinks flawed international order, but it still can hold up there. And again, to give you one example of it, the Russians did not succeed in Ukraine. The Russians
True.
did not succeed there. And that was a case where when you had the Biden folks who were on board as part of that, and the Europeans are part of that, and Australia's part of that, Canada and Japan, you're thinking this is what the international community should be doing, rallying it. And had, the counterfactual, had the Democrats won in 24 or in the White House, we probably still would have had this idea in the international system. Um, we we always get this rationale that the Trumpists use, which is, oh, he identified the key issues. He identified the key issues, and they always say this about, for example, about NATO and defense spending, even though NATO in 2014 was saying we've got to up our defense spending too, but NATO, and now what happened? What happened with the NATO case is that NATO, almost most of the members are beyond 2% of GDP. Some are beyond 3.5. The polls are going up towards 5. And everybody says, oh, Trump brought all of that about. It's like, well, no, Trump didn't bring that about because of part of a functioning alliance. He brought that about from NATO members because he's a threat. And in the same way, Donald Trump is forcing countries to reassess their security and reassess their political, economic, and military actions, not because the Americans are allied with them, but because at least under the Trump folks, you have a potential, at best, someone on the sidelines and someone who might be an adversary. Uh, where it winds up, that's going to be the interesting part, because as I said, we're talking about a process which will be months and possibly even years in terms of where it lands.
Which then brings us to another very real thing that will be happening relatively soon. I think within about a week or so, we're expecting to see President Trump meet up with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. Now, I want your take on this. There's been some rumor suggesting that Trump wants to have a grand bargain with Xi Jinping. He wants to bring an end to war because he's a sympathetic, empathetic, and very caring and sharing kind of guy. The US president that is. And I'm wondering whether or not that's even real. I mean, considering the fact that the Chinese leadership must be a little bit freaked out by what's happening and would like to see things calm down, to what degree do you think Xi Jinping will try to outmaneuver Trump, but at the same time not freak him out and give him some hope that there can be a grand bargain, possibly with the well, I don't know, let's say throwing Taiwan under the bus, which is a
Yeah.
small price to be paid for global stability and peace, and creating a sort of G2 framework, if you will. So, what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Well, the Chinese are going to play him like a fiddle. I mean, that's the first thing that takes place. And again, I'll kick you back to another example that people seem to have forgotten. I'm in the middle of writing a book about the wonder of Trump and the spectacle of Trump, versus the reality of what happened.
Mm.
And I go back to the North Korean case, and you remember, all that grandstanding when he decided not to blow up North Korea, but he was going to meet Kim Jong Un, around what, 2018, 2019. And at the end of it, what was agreed? What the hell was exactly agreed between the Trump folks and North Korea? Absolutely nothing was agreed. They had like a one-page memorandum that had absolutely no substance to it. North Korea still has its nuclear program. It still fires its missiles off occasionally just to show it can. It's so there was absolutely not, and North Korea in a sense got the space to do it by flattering Trump. Well, 2026, guess what the Chinese are going to do? Oh, so good to see you, Mr. Trump. So good. Look, here's your picture on these giant billboards all along the way. Look at gold. There's gold everywhere, Mr. Trump. Look, and here you go. And it's got to like, yeah, hi, cameras are here.
Yeah.
And then the Chinese are going to make their maneuvers. For example, they'll probably make their maneuvers to try to ease tariffs
Mm.
so they get more economic space in terms of what they want to achieve. They probably will get some sort of declaration that plays up to the idea of international, they might call it international peace and stability and et cetera, but it's more like to give the Chinese a free run in terms of where they want to go politically,
Mm.
militarily, beginning with the region, then extending out to the with Asia, then extending out to Asia Pacific, and then possibly on a global basis. And they will then let Trump go back to Washington, probably being very confident that he will wreak his own kind of special destruction, and they hope it's destruction that works to their advantage. And by that I mean, where's the Iranian foreign minister today, even as I speak? So, the latest is that, and this is interesting, the Iranians have gotten the diplomatic initiative. It's their
Yes.
proposal that's going to be the basis for talks. Well, the Iranian foreign minister is sitting in Beijing today talking to the Chinese foreign minister, right? So they're
Mm.
basically conferring over how they play this. If Trump, just to take the specific example on where we are, as he goes out to China this week, if Trump decides to resume the war on Iran, whether it's through airstrikes, renewed airstrikes, or, and I don't think this would happen, ground troops against Iranian islands, then the Chinese sit back, let the destruction wield, and realize that America's further isolating itself
Mm.
in a war that it will not win. If the Americans go to the negotiating table with Iran, uh, quite likely to have to reach a compromise with the Iranians, one which may leave the Iranians at least as part of an international group overseeing the Strait of Hormuz. China will exploit that space
Yeah.
that the
Mm.
Trump folks have quite clearly failed by going to war. They will look at their relations with the Gulf states, for example. They will come back in because the Iranian regime will still be in place and try to, and remember that the deal here would be that Iran will limit its nuclear program, but in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. Well, who does Iran sell 80% of its oil to? China, right? And off we go with this. It's not like the Chinese are absolutely perfect in their maneuvers, et cetera. But I think what I'm coming back to here is Taiwan's only a small piece of the puzzle here. And
Mm.
actually, I will say I differ a little bit from other analysts on Taiwan. I think the Chinese game on Taiwan is political and economic. I don't think
Yeah.
it's military.
Oh no,
I
I
think
agree
if
with you
they,
on that. Yeah.
yeah, if you go in military and you, in effect, invade Taiwan and try to make you do it that way, you blow that high line that you're trying to take, and that we're the people who do this the right way, the peaceful way, and so on.
Yeah.
And the fact here is the more that the Chinese expand their economic strength across Asia, they go back to Taiwan and say, you want to be part of this, right? You don't want to be going off and being independent and so on. You want to be part of this economic success that we've got going on.
I agree with everything that you say. But the other question, the countervailing question, Scott, would be, is China really prepared to be more activist internationally? Because up to now, it's played a very quiet, very cautious hand. It's not getting in the way of Donald Trump as he's making mistake after mistake after mistake. But at the same time, you're not seeing Xi Jinping and his CCP minions going out there stirring the pot actively and confronting American power in a way that I suppose a Western mind would understand. They may be doing it very
Yeah.
surreptitiously, but they're not doing it as, say, an imperial power would, as we would understand from a historic European basis.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, is that a Chinese strength or a Chinese weakness? And how do you think they would play their hand under the scenario that you've just laid out?
I actually modified a bit. I think it's more tactically when you see them on the global stage, they're doing it differently than in the sense of projecting military power
Yeah.
out there, and without the idea of we're in the political lead on
Mm,
this.
mm,
What first and foremost, I think you're talking about a Chinese uh, in terms of political economy, if you want to put it that way.
mm,
Look, here's these projects we can help you with. look, we'll build your sports stadiums. We'll go in, we'll build your transport systems. Look, we'll build your ports and work with that. Now let's get this economic relationship. And then of course they'll try to exploit that economic relationship to their benefit, as anybody would. So if anything, it's an economic imperialism.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really want to talk about it,
Yeah.
and a lot, but because we don't tend to think in economic imperialism those ways anymore, we think more of the political and military imperialism. You
Mm.
kind of miss that, and so on. And when it comes to where they play the military hand, it's regional. We have
Mm.
our military to protect our space. We protect our
Yeah.
waters around China. Now, this gets them into trouble with their neighbors.
Mm.
They'll wind up scrapping with South Korea and the Philippines and Japan about how far they push it. But it is not a global military footprint that they're trying to put on. In terms of the global political expression of they've they've taken over the fact that they're the multilateral power, right? It
They
used to be
have, yes.
the United States. Now it's China. So
Mm.
remind me, World Health Organization, pretty important during COVID and afterwards. Where's the U.S.? Out. Where's China? Vocally saying we're here in the forefront. And if you remember, China's on the hook over the start of COVID, not only the fact that it started there at the end of 2019, but the fact that they hid it from WHO for a few weeks, tried to tamp it down, nothing to see here. Um, they had screwed up royally. Now they look like they are the power that plays nicely in the World Health Organization. The United States isn't. And you can do this even, you can do it on climate change. Look, Chinese are still one of the top two alongside the United States in terms of greenhouse gases, in terms of pollutants that take place. But the Chinese project themselves to the rest of the world as we're willing to talk to you about agreements to limit this. And the Chinese also are making big moves to renewables as well.
Yeah.
Well, what's the United States doing? They're basically pulling out of international agreements and going back to fossil fuels.
Drill, baby, drill.
So Joe Baby Drill, and it's
Mm.
like, guys, and I've just been absolutely fascinated, which is that not just Trump, it's beyond Trump. I never think of this in terms of Trump now, because I don't think he's stable. In terms of the Trump camp, the advisors, some of the cabinet people that are there, but all those people involved in Project 2025, the business folks, the hard right activists, these guys are short term. I mean, they
Yeah.
are so damn short term. It's amazing. They're short term in terms of energy. They're short term in terms of economics. They're short term in terms of healthcare. And the Chinese, they don't always get it right. I certainly don't agree with a lot of what they do because they can be quite tough and ruthless. But they're going longer term with this. They're
Mm.
playing long term on this. So Trump's a blip. He's a blip. They'll go over. They'll flatter him. And remember one thing, John, and within this context, that we are no longer in a world which is defined the way that CNN put it in the 1991 Gulf War. We keep America on top of the world. It's not like an American portrayal that everybody taps into now. With the whole change in terms of media environments and where we're positioned, people will pick up their signals. They'll pick up their perceptions from very, very different places. I think that's highlighted by the current war in Iran. Um, what has been striking is that the Iranians have been playing to international opinion. They've been playing to Asian opinion. They've been playing to other populaces in the Middle East. They've even been playing to European opinion. And in effect, what's happened is that the Trump folks have ceded what we would have called soft power, or at least smart power, the way it was redefined. They've ceded smart power to the way that the Chinese are trying to approach it.
Okay, well, a couple of things that come out of that. First is, I want to bring in what I've been calling what I've been calling World War E. It's not a world war in
Mm,
the traditional sense, but it's a war over
no.
energy systems, choke points, supply chains, and economic endurance. Is that now the correct way to understand the crisis that we're all currently in?
Yeah, I think that's one aspect of it. I mean, I think we could, if you really think about it, it's the interconnections between um, economies, trade flows, capital flows, but very much there are drivers of those flows. Energy is one of them. I would say that tech and AI is another flow that you're talking about here.
Mm,
And
mm.
what happens is that you wind up getting certain vulnerabilities. I mean, uh, back in my younger days when I was far too geeky, not that I'm not geeky now, but far too geeky, you would wind up playing a game like diplomacy, for example. And in later
Ugh,
years,
me too. Me
right.
too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. In the 21st century version of civilization, one,
Mm,
two, three, four, five, I don't know what we're up to about 7 or 8 now, right?
mm.
And you realize that what happens here is you have certain vulnerabilities. That progress always brings vulnerabilities. And quite clearly in the energy sector, you've got a clear vulnerability, which is the reliance on fossil fuels. Now, what we had been thinking of in the reliance of fossil fuels is, well, they're going to run out at some point. Oh, and they're destroying the planet. That's still a vulnerability. What Iran has done, and people knew for years they could do this. Why the Trump folks didn't plan for this is amazing, is that you simply have the combination of the transport point
Mm.
and the energy point, and that's where you put the chokehold on it. It was
Yes.
interesting actually in that when the Americans planned around Iraq 2003, because part of that was oil, part of it was energy. The whole thing they were looking at that point was pipelines. They were looking at pipelines that run from the Middle East across into Europe and beyond, things like the BTC pipeline,
Mm.
right? Well, in this case, it wasn't the pipeline, it was the maritime route that everybody had just gotten used to. Well, it's covered by international law of the sea, conventional law of the sea, so you can't choke it off. Well, yeah, you can. What will be fascinating, and we just alluded to it to a minute ago, is whether drill baby drill is finally put to the side and people go, you got to go with renewables here. So I was speaking with someone yesterday about this, someone in a consultancy, very smart consultancy. And I said, look, give me a timeline on the shift to renewables. What does it take? And he put time frame of 6 to 10 years, right? You got to make it
Only.
through 6 to 10. Yeah, you got to make it through 6 to 10 years. I thought that as well. It was quicker than I thought he
Mm,
was going to say.
mm,
But he's
mm,
saying 6 to 10 years, right?
mm.
And that's where you're on a play. And again, to show you the short-sightedness of the Trump folks versus what you're talking about here in terms of this play. While the Strait of Hormuz mess goes on, and while we all watch the Brent oil price yo-yo, and while we should be looking at what's happening with LNG, liquefied natural gas,
For
given
sure.
that Qatar's lost 17% of its capacity for 5 years, up to 5 years, um, one of the Trump folks, I think it was Doug Burgum, the Interior Secretary, who goes before Congress, and someone's talking to him about the fact that Burgum's state, North Dakota, was like number 2 in the United States in terms of wind power. And someone said, why can't you do this in the United States? And he goes, oh, well, sometimes the wind doesn't blow and sometimes the sun doesn't shine, et cetera. And the guy just looked at me and said, oh, so you never heard of batteries then, right?
Mm, mm.
The whole development in battery storage that has taken place in the last few years, which precisely brings wind and solar onto a much more economic framework and on a much more of a framework in terms of reliability. That's a huge change. So the capability is getting there. It's the question of being able to roll it out,
And to
right?
scale up, and to scale up,
And to
because
scale up and to scale
I,
up.
I would say one thing about that, Scott, and while I'd like to think that I'm an optimist in terms of the green transformation, at least 80% of planet Earth is still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, whether it be liquefied natural gas or oil or diesel. And I would even go so far as to say one of the key issues with Australia right now is that we're currently finding out that most of our logistics, trucks, buses, vans, cars, everything that gets people from point A to point B in their daily life in commerce is all based on fossil fuels because, of course, the green transformation of our road networks is incomplete. I mean, arguably, it's barely scratched the surface of what needs to be done. And so, of
Yeah.
course, now we're all freaking out because the country people don't have diesel, so they can't drive the tractors to plow the fields to make sure that we have food. Then we've got the other problem: the diesel in the semi-trailers used to transport the food from the country into the city and then distribute it throughout the various supermarkets. Now, I know that the United States is in a pretty similar jam, which is kind of ironic in a way because they're meant to be, well, Trump is always saying, oh, well, we're the world's greatest producer of fossil fuels. Well, great. Okay. Drill, baby, drill. What is it doing for the American consumer right now? I would like to ask. And I'm wondering
Hmm.
whether or not a sensible answer will be able to come out of the White House. Because you would think that if Trump was the sort of arch nemesis that we all think he is, or many people think he is, the Darth Vader of our times, sitting stroking his kitty behind the
Hmm.
resolution desk, thinking, how do I screw the world over and make all of them come to me, the emperor, and make
Hmm.
sure that they all crawl to me so I can then dispense my favors whether I want to or not. Here, have a little bit of diesel. Here, have a little bit of liquefied natural gas. Ha ha! I'm not giving you any, you upstart. I mean,
Hmm.
if that was the plan, it's not working out all that well for him, right? So again, green transformation sounds great. It's very catchy. I'm very enthused by the notion that we're finally developing down there. But the path, 5, 6 years, gee whiz, Scott, I think that's being overly enthusiastic.
That's fair enough, and I'm willing to absolutely take that on board because I'm in the country of Ireland here, where I could tell you stories as well, which is there
Yeah.
should be a huge potential here in terms of wind power in particular.
Oh,
But the
sure.
failure of the country still to develop a distribution network for that wind power is just absolutely is a shocker. Now, I
Mm,
think what I'm putting to you this way, John, is you got both a short term and a long term here. And I think the short term here is no, you're not going to get away from the reliance on fossil, which is
mm,
precisely why the Australians have said we're going to have a strategic oil reserve here that we're going to have to build up.
yeah.
And I think, but what you have to do is, if you've got a responsible government, is you're doing both short term and, in fact, now medium term, which is
Mm,
right. Okay, fine. And I know these things cost money and there's all of this, but it's like you've got to now make that medium term planning that comes in there as well. I do
mm,
actually think it's interesting. Ireland is now talking about nuclear coming back in, which they had just ruled out, and that raises
yeah.
its own issues.
Yeah.
What I would say is that I'm going to take you back a few years, provided you don't have someone trying to wipe out a whole civilization like a particular US president threatened to do just a few weeks ago.
Mm,
Um, what you have is I'm always struck by the moment that we had in 2020, and that is when it came to a crisis point, which took it this point. It's like, okay, all hands went to the pump. And in terms of that story of the vaccine rollout and where we went with the pandemic, it sort of showed you that when you have responsible governments, when you have corporations working on the right side of humanity, as it were, that takes place, it is possible to do this. Now,
mm,
I want to go half full here and think we're in another one of those moments that I've already talked to you about what I think is the geopolitical turning point here with the
right.
realignment geopolitically. But you could take this in terms of energy sector and so on. And I think you could also apply this if we riffed on this maybe in a future podcast in terms of where we go with AI
Mm, mm.
and
Oh,
with
yes,
technology.
definitely.
And I think the fact here is that I'm just about to go and do a blatant self-promotion here.
Mm,
Something for the Instagram channel, which is about one of the latest bits of AI slop, which is Donald Trump and JD Vance and Marco Rubio and Doug Burgum and some woman, just so that it doesn't appear to be like four guys all swimming together in the reflecting pool in Washington that Trump's tearing apart.
yeah.
And it's like, yeah, that's AI slop, and we're going to get that. How do you get a harness on AI in terms of where that potential is and turn it into a positive way? And AI can do very, very positive things. But that leads you into questions, as is the case with energy, which is there are certain people who control, as it were, energy, certain people who control AI and tech, and we can think about Elon and all of his master plans, or arguably more important, Peter Thiel,
Yeah.
uh, one of the key guys behind Trump. And it's like, no, somehow you've got to get beyond these folks. You've got to get control back in terms of where it is. That's why I always go half full on renewables, because that's the only way out of the bind there. In terms of AI and tech, we similarly have got to find a half full approach here, which is to wrest back control of AI in a much more productive, valuable way. And I will just throw out one thing here. I mean, the forefront of this is the Trumpist attempt to tear apart EU legislation on tech and media. That they want this torn apart because they don't want any type of regulation in terms of where we go for it. And you absolutely have to have regulation,
Oh, yeah.
precisely because otherwise you get these tech AI choke points where people simply completely pervert or corrupt our systems.
Well, I mean, at the moment we're in this unenviable situation where the world is divided into, say, the Wild West of the tech frontier, which is out in
Yeah,
California. Then you've got basically Europe that's trying to create a sort of regulatory space, which, as you rightly point out, is hostile to everything the Americans stand for in terms of AI and tech. And then you've got the authoritarian model of China. So we
absolutely.
don't have a unified. I mean, it's one thing to always go back to the oh well, but we took care of nuclear weapons pretty well, didn't we? Yeah, that's different. That's a different sort of threat, and people could see that yes, once the button gets pressed, we're all dead. AI is a different sort of threat again, and it requires a different form of thinking because there are many good things about AI that we want to use, whereas with a nuclear weapon, there's just no good thing about a nuclear weapon
Yeah.
being dropped on a city, right? So there's a crisis in existentiality of the two. You know, there's a split between
Mm.
one being a grave threat and the other one being like something you see in a Hollywood movie like The Terminator, for instance.
Mm.
Not to be dismissed, but still we do need to have some form of regulatory authority that is
Yeah.
international, that we can all utilize it to our benefit, but at the same time, snuff out all the dangerous stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
I think that's right, and I think we're never going to get around the authoritarian in a way in terms of what happens within the national space, as it were,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
regrettable. I wish we could, but
Mm.
I do think in terms of in terms of the spaces we have which are not authoritarian, there's a way forward on this, which is very, very cooperative. I just think at the moment, and it's interesting again, I think it's a way that has to forward, at least for the next few years, without the Trump administration. I mean, there's
Yeah.
no way they're going to cooperate across that. And again, that's why it's interesting. It's why I look across at countries like Canada, countries like Australia, and indeed countries like India in terms of where
Mm.
they go. I will
Yeah.
just highlight one point here to get back to realignment on these multiple fronts. I don't know if folks out there notice, but for the first time, the European political community, which was created after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 2022. So these are not just the EU members, but it's other European countries. It's about 47 members, I think. Um, for the first time, you have a non-European power that shows up there. The Canadians were there. Um, well, that's Mark Carney, and that's Mark Carney who's making this big play about middle powers. It's time for
Yes,
middle
yes.
powers to realign and talk about it. And how much that resonates. So it'll be interesting to go for. I just happen, I like Carney. I'm quite partial to Carney. I have been since he was head of the Bank of England.
Mm.
Um, but it's going to take more than a single Mark Carney. It's going to be like, okay, where's Australia stand on this? Where do the Asian countries stand on this in terms of how they position vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the United States? And I think interestingly, as you talk about, remember a world where we may be shifting away from fossil fuels, where does that leave the Gulf states?
That's right.
Some of the wealthiest countries, on the planet. Yet that source of that wealth could be drying up, fairly soon.
Mm.
Um, so always trying to surf atop the realignments and trying not to fall off the board, just to use a very bad attempt at something that would appeal to an Australian audience in terms of an analogy.
Well, just a little bit of shameless self-promotion. Next week, we'll be speaking to former President of the UN Security Council, Kishore Mahbubani, and
Yeah.
we'll be talking about the whole middle power moment. So we'll dig in
Oh, no,
a
excellent.
yeah, we'll try to dig into a little bit more detail about the whole thing and the whole Mark Carney movement. But just getting back to an issue that we've left quite some time ago, but I'd like to bring it back, and that is Iran. And I don't want to talk about what the Americans are doing so much as what is the IRGC leadership doing? What are the remnant Ayatollahs structure doing? I mean,
Yeah.
do you think, in spite of their victory, and obviously you can see what they've done, they've come from a position of complete weakness. Now they're dominating a piece of strategic geography. It's a strategic win for them. You can't really mess around with that. I mean, that is what it is. But is there a point at which Tehran oversteps? Is there a point at which maybe they've got their own problems in terms of setting an agenda and being able to sustain it? I mean, we can
Yeah.
look at Trump and talk about his foibles and everything, and yes, that's all true. but we don't pay enough attention to what is happening within Tehran itself. I mean,
Yeah.
the regime prior to the war was on the nose with at least 80% of the Iranian population. Now, of course, if you want to be really technical about it, you can break down that 80% into
No.
those people who are hardcore against, or sitting on the fence, or sitting on the fence
No.
sometimes and then supporting the regime at other times. But now, because of the Israeli-American attack on Iran, that kind of dynamic has changed in that 80%. I think it's true to say that any country that is under attack by a foreign power tends to cohere, whether we want to
Yeah.
admit to it or not. It happened in Nazi Germany when the Allies were bombing the
Yeah.
Nazis. People were saying, "Well, how haven't they thrown Hitler out of power by now?" Well, people don't like getting bombed very much, sadly, and yet we still do the same thing, expecting a different result, which I think someone said is the definition of insanity. But anyway, that's another story. I would say, however, that it would be interesting to get your view on what you think is happening. And I know it's kind of speculative, but
Yeah.
what do you think is happening behind the walls of Tehran right now?
Well, I mean, I've got a lot of friends in Iran, John, because this goes back to when I taught there and worked there back
Mm.
before the 2009 um, rigged election and the
Yeah,
regime repression
yeah,
of mass protest. So I haven't been able to go back there since then, but I've maintained the contacts. And you've summarized it quite well from a starting point, which is that when, a nation is attacked, you don't see people hit the streets to overthrow the leadership quite often because they feel like they've been attacked as well. They might not like
yeah.
the leaders, but this is their country that's being
Mm,
attacked.
mm,
And if they did want to hit the streets and blame the leaders, the leaders would come back and say, well, you're just serving our enemies. That's the
mm,
starting point. I think another thing, just to say at the start, John, just slight correction to a lot of media narrative out there, which is, the Revolutionary Guards are in control of Tehran or the leadership is badly fractured. This is what the American Trumpists keep trying
yeah.
to say like, oh, we've got the upper hand. What you have is when I speak of regime, you're speaking of a system here. You're
Hmm.
speaking
Hmm.
of that theocratic system.
Yeah.
Now, the former supreme leader was assassinated at the start of the war. His son has been injured, but you're talking about a supreme leader's office.
Mm,
That's an entire institution that would be there. You then have other institutions that have clerics in them, as well as lawyers like the Guardian Council. You've got the Assembly of Experts, the Expediency Council. You've got the judiciary that we could talk about. You have got not just the Revolutionary Guards, they're the
yeah.
elite unit. You've got the paramilitaries besiege the standard army. In other words, this idea that it's a fractured system, this is ridiculous. What has unified this regime is they want to survive. Okay. And that's the starting point you have to realize.
Yeah.
Once you realize that, will they overstep the mark? I don't think they overstep the mark in terms of the region because I think they know they've got a lot of rebuilding to do. They've taken a hell of a lot of damage,
Mm,
and they have, you know, forget it. They to survive, they've actually damaged some of their ties. They had to attack the Gulf states
mhm,
to survive. They're going to have to realign there. They're going to have to realign with other powers in Asia in terms of where they are.
mm,
They will probably want to try to make nice with countries in Europe, get back to where they were before the 2015 nuclear agreement
yeah.
and try to build on that footing. Where they may overstep is internal, right? I mean, they
Mhm,
are in January, you're absolutely right. We had nationwide protests that lasted for weeks. They killed thousands, maybe uh, maybe tens of thousands, but there's no verification on that. So
yeah.
when the Trump folks, again, for their own interest, not for the interest of the Iranian people, say that 45,000 people were killed in Iran. We don't know that. But the regime killed thousands.
Mm,
They put others in prison. They put some of my friends back in prison. The if they go back to cracking down during a ceasefire, do they finally push people over the edge? And there's really two dimensions to this. One is the immediate thing when you come out of a war, and indeed after a whole series of crises, you just want to survive if you're an Iranian. Your economy has been damaged. Your currency is absolutely tanking. The Revolutionary Guards do control a lot of the economic institutions. It's tough to make ends meet, but somehow you got to try to do it. And when you have to try to make ends meet, that doesn't leave that much time. And I'm trying to say this without being flippant, doesn't leave as much time to try to protest and overthrow the regime. or even change it significantly. Now, on the other hand, they have now gone through decades of the regime limiting political, economic, and social space. What has it brought them? It brought them years of conflict before they got the 2015 nuclear agreement. They still are under the American and the international, there's still international sanctions on Iran as well for some of its activities. They are relatively damaged in the region. Um, all that effort in terms of supporting Hezbollah, supporting Assad, supporting the Houthis in Yemen is pretty much in tatters right now. So where's the greatness? Where is your nation? I think that if the regime goes in too hard with them, it could bring them back out on the streets. But that depends on the ceasefire. They will not come out on the streets while the U.S. is still threatening a war. They won't. If you were really seriously interested in Iranians in this, you wouldn't be dropping bombs on them.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
that's what ticks me off about the Trump folks, right? If you're seriously interested in Iranians, you would highlight, exactly as we're trying to do, what they experience on the ground,
Yep.
what their aspirations are, what their concerns are. You would try to build up links with them in terms of contacts, in terms of networks, and then you take it from there and let them guide you on what they want. Don't try to impose it on them.
Scott, the last two, I know that we're running out of time, but the last couple of questions I'd like to focus on the European theatre and
Yeah.
Ukraine in particular. It has not passed my notice that the Ukrainians are doing particularly well on the battlefield, considering the fact that people were early on in the war very easily dismissing them, saying, "Ah, they won't be able to hold their own. They're going to crumble. The Russians will be sitting in Warsaw. No, no, yeah, they'll be sitting in Warsaw for sure, but they certainly will be sitting in Kiev, drinking their
Yeah.
champagne and celebrating the revolution and all that kind of stuff." And it's been a long time since 2022 and all those
Mhm.
sort of pro-Russian things, and now all of a sudden we find Russia on the receiving end of some major long-range strikes. Now, recently the Ukrainians have, struck into Moscow itself. And coming three or so days away from May 9, which is, May Day,
Mhm.
where they have their big military parade, yeah, I think that that might be a subtle message to Mr. Putin about his war and just how unsafe he might be on May 9th when he's overseeing the magnificent Russian army without tanks and armored personnel carriers and artillery pieces and missiles.
Mhm.
It's an amazing thing how things have turned around. But getting back to what you were saying earlier about the Ukraine war, I want to say from my perspective, I think the Europeans have done magnificently here. And I think that it's easy, again, we pick these targets in the media and we make a big deal about stuff. And in actual fact, it's no real reflection on truth. So the Americans walked away from Ukraine and we all cried in our beer saying, how dare they? What are they doing? Don't they understand they ought to be supporting Zelensky and freedom for the Ukrainians? And all the while, the Europeans had already been prepared to help Zelensky without the Americans directly involved. And they've been doing a pretty sterling job. And the Ukrainian tacticians and operators are bloody awesome at what they do. So, riddle me this. Are we, do we have anything really to fear about Russia? I mean, I know it's easy to say that we should never undermine, what's the word I'm looking for? We should never see Russia for anything other than it is, a nuclear power, a scary power, the big Russian bear. But how much of that is just fetishizing a mythology about Russia as opposed to what actually the Russian military can do to Europe? Because my theory is if after 4 years of fighting the Ukrainians, a country 10 times smaller, and coming from a position of not being as technically magnificent in terms of their weapons production
Yeah.
initially, 10 times smaller than Russia, is able to fend off Russia.
Yeah.
What is that? What does that say about Putin's war? And where are we going with this? Is Europe actually stronger than we think it is? And is Russia weaker than we think it is? I don't know.
Well, I'm just about to go talk to Ukraine television, so I'm going to give you a teaser so you'll let me back in for the next
All right.
podcast. And so,
All right.
and that is, I'm speaking to you now 50 and a half months after the full-scale invasion, more than 4 years after the full-scale invasion that was only supposed to take a few weeks. This was Putin's legacy to make Ukraine part of Greater Russia, uh, physically annex part of the country, and put a puppet government in Kiev. Didn't work. What we are in the middle, if you had come and talked to me 3 months ago, you would have been talking about a critical moment for Ukraine, which is, yeah, that the Trump camp, by that, not just your chaotic president, more importantly, Vice President J.D. Vance and his
Yeah.
allies who don't believe in European security, don't believe in Ukrainian security,
Mm.
were trying to cut all aid. And then the Russians were trying to take out Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which they always try to do, but it was in the middle of one of the coldest winters in recent history.
Mm.
And it was like, can they hold out here? Especially because the European Union's 90 billion euro loan was being held up by the Kremlin's ally, Hungary's Viktor Orban.
Mm.
I was speaking to you in May, and Ukraine has survived the winter. Uh, they took another hit last night in energy infrastructure, but they still are holding the grid together despite the attacks. Um, the 90 billion euro loan has now gone through because Viktor Orban lost in the Hungarian elections uh, last month.
Mm.
So this is one of the key moments in history. It
Yeah.
seems mundane money, but this keeps Ukraine financed through 2027, both military and government finance.
Mm.
And Ukraine has developed the capabilities where it not only resists Russia on the front lines, the Russians gained very little territory this year. They gained almost no territory in March, and they lost territory, a net loss of territory in April.
Yeah.
Um, Not only is Ukraine doing that on the front lines, they now are hitting Russia, not just with this symbolic attack on Moscow a few days ago, getting through the air defenses. On a nightly basis, they're hitting oil refineries, terminals, ports, plants that support the Russian military, electrical components, for example.
Mm.
And the Russians don't appear to be able to have the air defenses to stop their Ukraine from doing that. Ukraine has fundamental weakness, which is manpower.
Mm.
They know that. But this is 21st century warfare. And what we have found is that in terms of this is the era of the drone war, or to be precise, the drone and the missile war. Um, it does not mean that Ukraine is going to win. Vladimir Putin is not, in a sense, going to withdraw from the 20% of Ukraine that he holds. But I do think it is a question of how much time is it before Putin accepts a ceasefire, which divides Ukraine on the current front lines. He's resistant to do that. He wants the rest of a key region called Donetsk in the east of the country.
Yeah.
Ukraine quite rightly says this is our fortress belt that protects the rest of the country. So no. But do you still have to fear the Russians here? You do. You fear them not because of the nuclear weapons. You fear them not because of the conventional weapons. You fear them wherever you are because of the political warfare.
Mm.
And that is, and you will have people in Australia that are like this. You have them here in Ireland. You have them across the continent. You have them in the US who say, Russia's the victim here.
Mm.
Russia, the invader, the aggressor, the mass killer, is the victim here. It's the international system that has tried to punish Russia.
Mm-hmm.
This is Russia's last play because it's not just you and me they're trying to work on. They're trying to work on Donald Trump's advisors, notably the real estate developer Steve Witkoff. Give us what we want for our security. And so that political information battle has to be waged even while the front line is stalled. And I will close on the upbeat. The
All
EU
right.
came forward, and
Yep.
EU can be criticized. Oh God, it can be criticized on a daily basis. I mean, but the EU and NATO stepped up here to the point where Donald Trump did not simply take his ball and go home. And as Donald Trump, in another piece of AI slop this week, held up 5 cards from the game Uno, why, I don't know, but said, I have all the cards. Ask anyone in Ukraine right now who has the cards, and they may talk to you about their president named Volodymyr Zelensky.
Absolutely. That's a really good note to end this conversation on. Scott, this has been a sobering and a necessary conversation. You know, the old assumption that American power, for all its flaws, helped hold the global post-World War II system together. Well, today we're forced to ask whether American power under domestic strain, strategic overreach, call it what you will, even political volatility, is now also helping to pull that system apart. Thanks, Donald. Iran, energy, NATO, Ukraine, Europe, democracy, these are not separate crises anymore. They are converging into one larger question. Can the international system survive a permanently unstable America? Scott Lucas, thank you once again for joining us on The Focus.
Thank you, John. Look forward to the next time already.
Thank you. Now on to questions for our audience. Has America crossed the line from global stabilizer to global disruptor, or is the world overreacting to Trump era chaos? If the Iran war triggers a prolonged global energy crisis, do you believe Western governments, including Australia's, are actually prepared for the economic and political consequences? What worries you more right now, Russia and China challenging the international order, or America's growing internal instability weakening it from within? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this discussion, please like, subscribe, and share the episode. My thanks to the producers of The Focus, Neil Smart and Lynn Sear from Adelaide, South Australia. I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to The Focus Podcast.